Thomas Miller pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders as the biting October wind swept down Willow Street. The warm glow of neatly spaced porch lights and the faint hum of televisions from nearby homes should have comforted him, but something about tonight felt wrong. It was nearly midnight, and the street was eerily quiet, save for the faint creak of a rusted weather vane atop the Jenkins garage. The flickering street lamp at the corner of the block cast unsettling shadows, stretching tree branches like skeletal fingers across the pavement. Then he heard it. "Help me, please!" The voice carried through the still night, sharp and desperate. Thomas froze mid-step, his pulse quickening. It wasn't just the plea itself, it was the tone, familiar yet foreign, as if it was meant specifically for him. "Is someone there?" he called out, his voice cracking against the oppressive silence. He scanned the empty street, eyes darting between the darkened houses. But there was no movement, no sign of life, just the faint rustle of leaves swirling at his feet. He hurried home, his chest tight with unease. As he fumbled with his keys at the door, a prickling sensation ran down his spine, the distinct feeling of being watched. He whipped around, his gaze locking on the far end of the street, where the shadows seemed unnaturally thick. The voice echoed again, faint but resolute. The next morning, under the soft light of dawn, Willow Street returned to its picturesque normality. Thomas walked his daughter Sarah to the school bus stop, their usual morning chatter feeling strained. At 16, Sarah was bold and inquisitive, often teasing her dad for his teacherly seriousness. But even she noticed something off in his demeanor. "Are you okay, Dad?" she asked, her hazel eyes narrowing. "You look like you didn't sleep." Thomas offered a weak smile. "Just one of those nights. Probably too much coffee," he lied. Later that day, he mentioned the voice to Jake Thompson, his retired cop neighbor, during a casual chat over the fence. Jake's face darkened, the lines around his mouth deepening. "Don't think too much about it," Jake said gruffly, his eyes darting away. "Willow Street's always had its quirks." By the weekend, Thomas met Emily Rivera, the librarian who had recently moved into the house at the end of the block. She was warm but guarded, her dark eyes betraying a hint of unease when Thomas casually mentioned the strange call he'd heard. "You too," she murmured, almost to herself. "It's always a man, isn't it? And always the same time." Thomas stared at her, startled. "You've heard it before?" Emily hesitated, then shook her head. "Maybe just my imagination," she deflected, though her tightened jaw suggested otherwise. The neighborhood was pristine by all appearances. Neatly trimmed hedges, freshly painted mailboxes, children riding bikes in the afternoons. But underneath its polished veneer, Willow Street harbored something unspoken. Everyone seemed to know but avoided the topic, a quiet conspiracy that bound them together. That night at 11 p.m., Thomas found himself drawn to his window. The street lamp flickered again, and his pulse quickened. Just as he decided to turn away, he saw the faint silhouette of a man at the far end of the street. The figure stood motionless, his face obscured by shadow. "Help me!" the voice called again, low and pleading. Thomas shut the blinds, his hands trembling. The cries came every night at 11 p.m. without fail. Each time, Thomas would hear the same desperate plea, "Help me, please." The voice never grew louder, never varied in tone, as if stuck in some dreadful recording. And each time, the silhouette of a man stood at the end of the street, just under the flickering light. By the fifth night, Thomas could no longer ignore the oddities within his own home. It started small. A coffee cup left in the sink would reappear on the counter. The thermostat would reset itself to an icy 55 degrees, even though he never touched it. But then Sarah began waking up screaming in the middle of the night, her face pale and her sheets soaked in sweat. "I keep seeing him," she whispered one morning, her voice trembling. "The man from the end of the street. He's in my room, Dad, just standing there, staring at me." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He tried to reassure her, blaming bad dreams, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Sarah wasn't the only one affected. He too had started seeing fleeting shadows in his peripheral vision and feeling an oppressive heaviness in the air. By the seventh night, Thomas had had enough. He marched over to Jake's house, his frustration outweighing his fear. "You know something about this," he accused, his voice tight. "You said not to think about it, but this isn't normal. What's going on here?" Jake sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "It's not something people around here like to talk about," he admitted, his voice low. "But you've noticed, haven't you? Nobody ever helps them. Not the man, not anyone who shows up at the end of the street. We don't intervene, we don't look too closely, and we never go outside when we hear the voices. Why? Thomas pressed. Jake hesitated, then leaned closer. Because bad things happen when you do. You remember the Bakers? A couple years ago, they tried to help a woman crying outside their house. The next day, their son had an accident. Fell down the stairs, they said, but he didn't survive. And the woman, no one ever saw her again. Thomas felt his stomach churn. What does that mean? What do you think it is? I don't know, Jake muttered. But whatever it is, it's been happening here for as long as I've lived on this street, and I've learned not to ask too many questions. Refusing to accept vague warnings, Thomas sought out Emily Rivera the next day at the library. When he mentioned the nightly cries, her face fell. I was hoping it wouldn't happen to you, she said, her voice quiet. It's like a chain, you know? Once you notice it, you're part of it. Thomas frowned. Part of what? Emily, what aren't you telling me? She glanced around, then motioned him toward a small study room. Inside, she pulled out a folder filled with old newspaper clippings and laid them out on the table. These are from the Springfield Gazette, she explained. Men have been disappearing from Willow Street for decades. Most were strangers, vagrants, door-to-door salesmen, delivery drivers. But a few, they were neighbors, people we knew. Thomas scanned the headlines. Local man missing after mysterious call. Disappearance linked to Willow Street house. Family moves after tragic incident on Willow Street. Each article painted a grim picture, though no two stories aligned perfectly. But one detail caught his attention. The disappearances always happened after a voice was heard at night. You knew about this? He asked, his voice shaking. Emily nodded. I've been trying to understand it since I moved here. I think the voices are connected to whatever happened on this street years ago. Something bad, something no one talks about. How do we stop it? Thomas asked, desperation creeping into his voice. I don't know if we can, Emily replied softly. But I think we need to start by finding out what really happened. That night, Sarah's nightmares worsened. She described shadowy figures crowding her room, their mouths moving silently. Jake's house, too, wasn't immune. He confided in Thomas that he'd been finding scratch marks on his walls, though no one had been inside. The phenomena were intensifying, as if whatever haunted Willow Street knew they were trying to uncover its secrets. By the time 11 p.m. rolled around, Thomas stood at his window, watching the shadowed figure under the street lamp. For the first time, he felt a pull, a nagging instinct to go outside and confront it. Help me, please, the voice called again, this time with a sharper edge. But Thomas stayed put, his hands trembling at his sides. He wasn't ready, yet. By the 14th night, the calls grew more urgent. Each cry for help reverberated through Thomas's mind, long after it had faded into the still night air. Sarah had stopped speaking about her nightmares altogether, retreating into a silence that unnerved him more than her screams ever had. But the worst came when Thomas found her staring out her bedroom window at 11 p.m., the curtains drawn back and her breath fogging up the glass. I think he's crying, she whispered, her tone eerily calm. Thomas pulled her away from the window, his heart pounding. You can't look at him, Sarah. Do you hear me? Don't look. He shut the curtains, but he could feel the figure's presence, as if its gaze were boring through the walls. The next morning, Thomas met Jake and Emily in Jake's garage. The atmosphere was tense, the faint smell of oil and dust thick in the air. Emily spread out more of her research. Faded photos of Willow Street from the 1950s, grainy black and white images of smiling families in front of pristine homes. But one photo caught Thomas's attention. A group of men standing in the middle of the street, shovels in hand, their faces solemn. This is it, Emily said, pointing to the photograph. I found it in an old archive labeled Willow Street Drainage Project. But look closer. There's no evidence that any project ever took place here. Jake leaned in, his brow furrowed. What are you saying? They buried something? Emily hesitated. Or someone. That night, the trio decided to confront the shadowy figure. They set up camp in Jake's backyard, a clear vantage point to the end of the street. Emily brought a voice recorder, while Jake armed himself with a flashlight and an old service revolver. Though Thomas doubted it would do much good. At exactly 11 p.m., the street lamp flickered. The figure materialized, its silhouette clearer than ever. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with tattered clothes hanging loosely off his frame. But his face seemed to shift, blurring between distinct features. A young man's frightened eyes, an older man's clenched jaw, a boy's hollow cheeks. "Help me," the voice pleaded, raw and anguished. Emily clicked on the recorder, her hand shaking. "Who are you?" she called out. The figure didn't respond, but it began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it stepped toward them, its feet dragging on the asphalt. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as the air grew heavy, suffocating. "Stop," Jake commanded, shining the flashlight directly at the figure. The beam wavered, bending unnaturally as if the light itself couldn't touch the entity. The figure paused, its blurred face locking onto Thomas. "Help me," it repeated. But this time the voice fractured, overlapping with others. A cacophony of voices erupted, men, women, children, all crying out in unison. Thomas staggered back, clutching his head. He saw flashes, images that weren't his own. A pit dug in the middle of Willow Street, frantic whispers, dirt-streaked faces, and the crushing weight of silence as the last shovelful of earth was thrown over the bodies. "They buried them alive," Thomas gasped, his voice breaking. "Oh my God, they buried them alive!" The figure stopped moving and tilted its head, as if acknowledging the revelation. For a moment, the air stilled and the oppressive dread lifted. Emily pieced it together later that night. Decades ago, during the construction of Willow Street, a catastrophic accident occurred, a collapse of an underground drainage tunnel. Workers were trapped, their cries for help echoing through the night. But rather than face the scandal and costs of a rescue, the contractors, and perhaps the community, made a horrifying decision. They sealed the tunnel, silencing the cries forever. "But they didn't stay silent," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "They've been calling out ever since, waiting for someone to listen." Jake's face was pale, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette. "The unspoken rule," he muttered. "It wasn't just fear, it was guilt. They knew what they'd done, and they made sure we never opened that door again." The group realized the spirits were caught in a loop, reliving their final moments every night. The voices, the figures, the chilling phenomena. It was all tied to the community's collective silence. The unspoken rule was a pact to keep the secret buried, but it had condemned the souls of the workers to eternal torment. "We have to break the cycle," Thomas said firmly. "We have to acknowledge what happened. If we don't, this will never stop." The next day, Thomas, Jake, and Emily knew they had to act. They couldn't let the horrors of the past continue to fester in silence. But the task ahead felt insurmountable. How could they get the entire neighborhood, so conditioned to ignore and avoid, to confront the truth? It started with Emily. At her urging, Thomas and Jake helped her draft a message for the community, delivered in the form of a simple flyer slipped into every mailbox on Willow Street. "We know the voices, we know the figures. Meet us at the corner of Willow Street at 11 p.m. tomorrow. Together, we can end this." The response was mixed. Most residents ignored it, dismissing it as nonsense, or fearing repercussions for acknowledging what they had buried so long ago. But a handful of neighbors, young couples, newer residents, and a few older ones who'd carried the weight of their guilt for decades, showed up. At 10:45 p.m., a small crowd gathered under the flickering street lamp. Nervous murmurs rippled through the group as they shifted uneasily, their breath visible in the chilly October air. Sarah stood close to Thomas, clutching his hand tightly. Emily held her voice recorder, and Jake kept watch, his flashlight aimed at the ground. Emily stepped forward, her voice clear but trembling. "We know what happened here," she began. "The voices we hear every night, they're the men who were trapped, abandoned, and forgotten. They've been asking for help, and we've ignored them. But we can't keep pretending anymore." An older woman, Mrs. Caldwell, stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "I remember," she said, her voice cracking. "My father worked on this street. He told me they couldn't save them, but they could have tried. They chose not to." She sobbed, covering her face. "I didn't know it would follow us." As 11 p.m. approached, the air grew dense, almost electric. The street lamp flickered violently, plunging the corner into shadow before sputtering back to life. The crowd stiffened as the figure appeared again, its silhouette sharp and distinct. This time it wasn't alone. Multiple figures emerged from the darkness, each one murmuring overlapping pleas for help. Their voices grew louder, the anguish palpable. Emily switched on her recorder and stepped forward. "We hear you," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her. "We know what happened to you, and we're sorry. We're here to remember you." Thomas joined her, his voice shaking. You were wronged, forgotten. But we won't let you be invisible anymore. We'll tell your story. We'll make it right. Jake raised his flashlight, shining it directly at the figures. This time the light didn't waver. The faces became clearer. Men of varying ages, their expressions a haunting mix of despair and relief. The group held a small vigil right there on the street. Mrs. Caldwell recounted her father's stories, while Emily read aloud the names of the missing workers she'd uncovered in her research. Others in the group added their voices, sharing memories, speculations, and confessions. As the clock struck midnight, the figures began to dissolve into the air, their forms fading like mist. The oppressive weight that had hung over Willow Street for years seemed to lift. A faint whisper passed through the crowd. "Thank you." The street lamp, for the first time in years, stopped flickering and cast a steady, warm light over the gathering. The following day, Thomas and the others organized a formal memorial. They invited local news outlets, historians, and anyone willing to listen. A plaque was erected at the corner of Willow Street, bearing the names of the men who had been lost, along with an inscription, "In memory of those who were silenced, may your voices echo forever." For the first time, the community came together in shared acknowledgement. The secrets that had bound them in fear were finally exposed to the light. That night, as Thomas tucked Sarah into bed, she looked at him with tired but peaceful eyes. "They're gone now," she said softly. "I don't see them anymore." Thomas kissed her forehead, feeling a sense of relief he hadn't known in weeks. As he lay in his own bed, he listened to the stillness of the night. No voices, no shadows, just the gentle hum of the world moving on.